Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to another SDEC session. My name is Adam Greco and I'm with Search Discovery and I'll be moderating behind the scenes here. Today we're going to be doing a session in our digital strategy area, our topic area, and it's going to be related to privacy and analytics. Just a little housekeeping items. If you are new to the SDEC, we are a free educational community that does weekly webinars on topics related to digital marketing and digital analytics. If you're not an official member, it's totally free to join. I will be putting some information in the chat with a link to join if you want to join. And the benefit of joining is that you will be notified ahead of time of all of our sessions and you can tell us which topics you want to subscribe to. There's also a Slack group that we have for the SDEC, and there is where we post all of the recordings for all of the sessions that we've done. We've got over about 50 recordings right now. During the session, if you have any questions about the SDEC, you can ping me in the chat and I'll answer those. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation for our presenter, Jodi, you can put that in the Zoom Q&A and we will get to all of those questions at the end. So with that, I'm so excited to have Jodi Daniels on, who's one of the renowned experts in the area of privacy and analytics. So Jodi, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thank you so much for presenting today.
Absolutely. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you everyone for participating. So to get started, I'm going to do my fancy little thing as a friendly reminder. While we're going to be talking about a little privacy and law, I'm not actually a law firm, so I have to tell you that the materials that we're going to talk about today are only for informational purposes. All right, now to the fun stuff. So we're going to talk about privacy and digital analytics and digital marketing and kind of how we got here, a very high level privacy 101 of the various laws, and then dig into a bit of some of the other key elements of kind of where we are, what's happening in the browser community, and what we need to be thinking about going forward. So to continue our conversation, kind of where are we? Well, consumers care about privacy. 3 in 10 users deploy ad blocking software that can prevent companies from tracking anything. 3 in 10. That's a lot of people. Consumers want to see that the security and privacy is made as a corporate value. Literally, the call I was on right before this was talking about how privacy is now being considered a part of the ethics and the social responsibility and trust and governance of how companies are managing from fair trade, ethical resourcing, carbon neutral, and now privacy is considered one of those elements. They really don't want third-party sales of their data any longer. They want control. They want clarity about how they can set their privacy settings. They want control. And if the company is not comfortable with what is happening with their data, they're likely to walk away. 39% will just walk away and say, you know what, I'm not even going to do business with you. So the idea of privacy and trust at the beginning of an experience in a relationship with an individual is critical. Otherwise, we might lose them. And think about how much effort goes into acquiring a new customer, keeping a new customer. Then
hey Jodi. Hey, I'm
yes,
sorry to interrupt, but I think we may have a double monitor issue because we're not seeing your slides.
Thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
I just saw that over. Thank you all. Technology glitches. Everyone should hopefully see them now. Do you see a beautiful slide with people?
I see it. See it now.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much. Well, it's the only pretty slide that you've missed, everyone, so it's okay. With that being said, next beautiful slide. 8 in 10 adults say that they're concerned about how companies are using the data collected about them. But 10% believe that they'll actually trust a company. So I just said 40% or 39% are going to walk away if they don't trust you. 8 in 10 are concerned about what's happening, and like 10% are, we trust what's happening. And half of Americans then say, you know what, I'm really concerned. I don't know if I want to give personal information because I don't know what's going to be happening. And that counts in the world of the digital landscape that we have, not only just giving you a name and an email. Maybe you've gone to a website, the first thing that pops up is that cookie consent banner, and you're thinking, well, I don't know who you are, and I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe you don't click. Yes, it's okay to do that. Or maybe you go and disable those cookies right away because you know what's happening and it's a site that you're not really sure what's going on. Now, with that bit of a background of how important privacy is, what the consumer view is, we're going to dive into the kind of privacy law 101, I call it. And one of the things that I didn't talk about is who this is important for. Well, I've talked about the consumer piece, but at the same time, if you're in a B2B environment, your customers care about what is happening with the data and how you as a company are managing privacy. In addition, if you're thinking about selling your company, maybe you're looking for investment dollars, maybe you're looking to acquire companies. From that standpoint, you also want to be thinking about privacy because those stakeholders are asking the questions and are evaluating every different part of privacy in the organization. So to dive into our privacy law 101, and actually before I do that, Adam, this would be a perfect time for our first polling question.
Okay, you all should see the poll now. Gonna wait till we get about 70% of the people. Okay, about 5 more seconds, get your answer in. Okay, so Jodi, you should be able to see the results here.
Yes, I do. So about 35% of you have a dedicated privacy officer or team. A small group has no one, but 20% of you don't know. So of the don't knows, I encourage you after this call to go find out who in your company is going to be responsible for privacy. So if you had a privacy question, who would you go and ask? So thank you so much. I'm going to close that off my screen. And with that, GDPR. It's the General Data Protection Regulation. It's about to celebrate its 3rd birthday. So we're still in toddlerhood for GDPR. And it is the EU privacy law that really made headlines and big global waves in the industry. What's unique about GDPR is it doesn't care what type of organization you are. You can be a nonprofit, you can be a small company, a solo blogger, a big company, it doesn't matter. The law can apply to you if you are processing data, knowingly processing data, purposefully processing data on EU residents. Now, sometimes people say, well, does it follow the citizen? It does not. So if Jodi now is from France and Jodi visits the United States for vacation or holiday, then that does not automatically mean that GDPR followed me, but it does mean that Jodi living in America who goes to France for vacation or holiday there, when I'm in that environment, I am kind of covered underneath that umbrella. So GDPR is what often prompted everyone to see the cookie banners and the requirement to ask for consent. Not all cookie banners are created equal. They're not all set up the proper way. GDPR also has a long list of other requirements. And the biggest piece that I want you to take away from GDPR, because this is not going to be a massive presentation on GDPR, we're going to do some high levels to kind of give you a framework of what's happening in the privacy world. But the most important thing you should think about is GDPR requires notice. Tell the person what you're doing with the data and in a way that I can actually understand it. 2, give me choices. So I have a variety of individual rights. I get to exercise them. I can delete information, access information, opt out of information. And one of the critical pieces that's connected to that whole cookie banner piece is I need a legal basis to use data. I have to have a business purpose, and GDPR gives me 6 legal, 6 grounds to be able to use the data. moving along. Some of you may or may not have heard, feel free to kind of mention in the chat if you've ever heard of the e-privacy regulation. It does not get, and actually I should say the e-privacy directive. We're about to move to an e-privacy regulation. It doesn't get as much love, but it actually is what controls the digital marketing activities in Europe. Think about here, we have CAN-SPAM. You have the ability to opt out of a phone call. You had the Ad Choices Alliance here. You had all these ways to be able to manage digital communications. In Europe, it's the e-privacy directive, and it's literally going through updates. It's taken years, 6+ years, and we're close to some drafts actually getting passed to the e-privacy regulation. There's a lot of words on this slide. It's not meant for you to study them. You'll absolutely have access to the slides and can study them later. But the whole philosophy is that is actually where the notion of consent and cookie banners came from. And it's the idea that you have some type of consent. Some had implied, scrolling, does that count? Some had opt-in, some had just being able to opt out. So all different ways. But from a GDPR point of view, if you remember, I said you had to have a lawful basis. One of those is consent. And the consent piece is very specific what it needs to include. So hence our beautiful cookie banners that are supposed to have the ability for the user to click yes, then the cookie fires, not the cookie fires, then I click OK, and maybe you did something. It's supposed to be cookie consent, yes, then you fire the pixel. So I just want you to kind of know that there's future regulation coming out of Europe that will have a drastic impact on the digital activities that we're all doing today. Now, let's move back to the United States here. So in the United States, we have the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. It was passed 2018, became effective and enforceable in 2020. It's different than GDPR. It really is an opt-out law, with the exception of anyone here is targeting children. If you're targeting children, which is 16 and under, and actively targeting children, then you have some different requirements. For today's conversation, I'm going to assume we're over that. So CCPA is very much a notice law, give me some choices, let me opt out. It has a new cousin coming on board in January 2023. In November 2020, Californians voted not just for a president, but for a new law. And so this particular law really kind of extends CCPA and actually moves it a bit closer to GDPR. Now, again, there's so many items in these laws that we cannot cover all of them here today. So if your heart really wants to know more about these laws, I'd be delighted to talk to you about them. But just kind of know that there's more. If you almost had a chart, we're at the bottom corner, we've moved upwards to GDPR. Still notice, still choice, but what happens is anyone doing cross-device tracking is going to be impacting, because there's this concept of selling that's under CCPA. That's the long, beautiful definition on the left, which talks about the sharing of data for other valuable consideration. That's the bottom of the definition. And that is where the ad tech piece comes into play. So basically, ad tech is in a kind of gray land and likely has the idea that when you share the data with that third party, the third party might be using it for their own purpose. You, the company, has sold the data to the third party. And now you have to go and comply with all this California special do not sell requirements. The new California law, which is an extension of the CCPA, adds in the concept of sharing and basically is very focused on the ability for users to be able to opt out of cross-device tracking. So something to be mindful of. Now enter our second comprehensive privacy law on the book so far, and it is Virginia, passed earlier this month. It is very similar to CCPA, really closer to the newer version of CPRA. However, the whole kind of sharing of data and the gray zone of if the other company gets to use it is carved out. So that's good news, but many of the activities that you're still doing might still be impacted by the Virginia law. So you'll want to be mindful of that. You might be asking, well, what other states are here for me to consider? Here's a beautiful chart from the Privacy Association that tracks all of the other states. hot off the press, closest next state is Washington State. It's back for the third time, and just this week actually shared it's kind of moved forward in committee with its next iteration. You might ask, what about a federal law? Are we really going to have 50 red states on here? You could. There is a federal law introduced every year, multiple laws always at the same time. We still have no federal law. So we'll just have to see what will happen. What will happen if we don't comply with all of this? Well, there's fines if you don't comply with the laws, and there's a data breach, and then there's class action lawsuits that can happen. But really, it's what we talked about at the beginning. It's the potential loss of sales and loss of trust, and also potential lawsuits. And there have been a variety of different lawsuits for companies not managing the consent properly, especially in the EU. Now, Adam, I think this would be the perfect time for our next polling question.
Okay, so put your votes in now. Okay, 10 seconds.
Okay, perfect. So about 52% of you are in the midst of preparing, 10% of you are so ready, and 38% of you are not so prepared. So that's okay. We'll have a good conversation. Thank you so much. I think before someone had asked how many people voted. 71 of you voted, so thank you this time around. Okay, so we're moving into the cookieless world. Probably not too surprising. The browsers aren't a huge fan of what's happening in the world of cookies and tracking. And it's kind of like kindergarten. There's some bad players, and then they make the rules for everybody else. It's kind of like kindergarten, right? Here's a little bit of a deeper dive of what is happening. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with Apple, and we're moving to an opt-in environment on iOS. Chrome is disabling its third-party cookies and really not creating a new identifier, but instead looking at other alternatives. Firefox has kind of been that way for a while. We already know Safari's sort of been that way as well. But then you also have this idea of global privacy control, where the parties are sort of moving together. And to me, this is the new version of what we had years ago in Do Not Track. So we'll have to see what will kind of come from all of this. And with that being said, I also thought it would be helpful to kind of break down. So we have the cookies, but we also have the laws. So we have this idea of can and can't, and should and shouldn't. So our browsers are really applying what we can do from literally a technical capability, but we also have the laws in helping us understand what we can or can't do from a legal point of view. So if I look at GDPR and the e-privacy pieces, it's really very much an opt. It's off by default. The cookie banner should should show the user hits accept, kind of what I said before. Then I say okay, then it should fire. Now there are a few exceptions if it is a strictly necessary cookie. And in some countries and in some situations, an analytics cookie all by itself could be considered a strictly necessary cookie if the analytics company is not getting the data for other purposes. So if you had Google Analytics on and that data is not also being shared with the Google Ads piece, then you might be able to say it was strictly necessary, or kind of use one of the legal bases called legitimate interest. But there's a variety of exceptions in that area. So I highly recommend, for those of you with privacy teams, you talk to the privacy team. For those of you who don't know, go figure out who your privacy team is, or contact someone who can help you work through those particular scenarios. Because again, there are a variety of lawsuits and fines associated with it. So you don't want to be in one of those buckets. From a US perspective, it's an opt-out. So you might wonder, well, why are there all these cookie consent banners? And do I have to have one? And do I have to have the user opt in or out? Well, we don't have these strictly necessary in advertising and analytics pieces here in the United States quite the same way. And the United States does not require you to have a banner and require you to allow people. What's happened is companies understand that that's the movement for consumers. They want to provide that opportunity for their customers to make the decision. They want to provide transparency. They want to be able to create that element of trust. So they've created a banner and made it really easy for people to be able to manage the settings. So I highly encourage you to look at the cookies from that standpoint, or have a really easy place for people to be able to manage them. So I thought this would be kind of a helpful chart. Again, it's a lot of words, the intent being that you can study these slides sort of at another time. If you sort of just look at some of the other typical advertising areas, you have, paid social, SEO, all these types of things. It's all kind of the same philosophy, which is how are you using the cookie, and what was the banner? What did the language say? So sometimes I'll just see we use cookies to improve our experience. And then you're actually having advertising cookies. That doesn't work. The banner is the place of notice. So you need to have an actual description of what you're doing, and it has to match what you're actually doing. So if you have a banner one way, because that's what you're doing today, and in 6 months you change, then you need to also update the banner, the privacy notice, and everything else that connects it all. It should be a consistent experience. And so here's just a little bit more. So for kind of the essence of time, one of the big pieces that you have to be considering is understanding what data you have. Think about what trackers are you using? Who are the companies that are participating? Then think about the third parties that might be helping you. Do you have an agency? Is it all in-house? Are you the agency? If you are the agency, you have to think about your clients. They might be coming to you asking, I need you to limit the type of information that you receive. That actually should be the situation. You want to limit who has access to any of what can be considered the personal data to the fewest number of people as possible. That lowers the risk for all involved, and the requirements potentially as well. So the very first step is to understand the data you have. What are you using to connect? And where is all of that stored, and who is using it? You need to determine, is there a sale of data? Because if you share data with a third party, the third party has access to it, and you don't have a contract in place that limits what they can do, you might have actually just sold the data under the law. You might be saying, well, Jodi, I didn't sell the data. They're just a service provider. Right. But if you didn't say that, then it kind of defaults that you sold the data. So it's critical to know what your data you have, who you've shared it with, who the vendors are, so that you can ensure all vendors, third parties, and service providers, which by the way are all different definitions in CCPA, but often the commonplace is like not us, it's them. You need to make sure you know who they are, and that they are all complying with whichever law is applicable to you. So you want to be thinking about your privacy notice. I see very often that the requirements for all the different trackers and elements that you might be using are excluded from the privacy notice. And many times there are very specific requirements that those companies say needs to be in there. A Google one is a really easy one. Can't tell you how many companies are missing that. But Google Analytics has very specific language that has to get dropped in that privacy notice. Honoring individual rights. If Jodi comes and says, I want to opt out, can you do it? Do you know what you would need to do? Honoring individual rights is required under all of the laws. It's a fundamental it's a fundamental step and piece for all of these different privacy laws that exist out there. And then manage the marketing messaging. So we've talked about the can and can'ts. The should and should is here. This is the opportunity to connect with our customers and explain to them why it's okay. Please, why? This is why you want to accept our cookies. This is why you want to give us your email address. This is what we're going to do with that email address. And it's an opportunity to alleviate any of the objections that an individual has and gain their trust. If you remember at the beginning of our conversation, I said that there are many people who, 79% of them, don't feel comfortable sharing personal information. In the messaging, you might be wondering what you can and can't do, but it's also, and should and shouldn't, but it's also where we can connect with our customers or our prospects. So the idea is kind of, what are our options? The view is cookies are really going away. We're going to be moving to some type of other identifiers and other ways to be connecting and advertising and analyzing all of the activity that we have. How efficient and effective is our advertising and analytics? I came across this. I thought this would be really kind of an interesting visualization where in a cookieless world, using Google Analytics, how would you be able to measure? Well, it wouldn't be down to what Jodi did at an individual level, but it would be able to, if you kind of aggregated them all together, that type of attribution and would be good enough. I'd still be able to measure the effectiveness, but not down to the individual piece. So you have to think about, what do you have today that is at that individual level? And what do you need to change to make it still meaningful? How will you be able to measure your campaigns in a new environment? Will this work for you? Or are there any changes that have to happen? And this is just an example utilizing Google Analytics. What's the future? Well, we're going to continue to have restrictions. You're also going to have innovation from other companies who are going to either try and circumvent that blockage, and you'll have to decide, is that a company that I trust and I want to do business with yourself? There also will be other types of identifiers, as the email being an identifier, the phone number being an identifier. And you have to decide, if Jodi gives you your email, gives me my email to you to email me, is it expected and okay that you're going to use my email now as an identifier through these other advertising technologies to be able to still deliver my ad? So before it was cookies, we've kind of moved from that, and we're going to use some other type of mechanism. There's a lot of companies moving in this direction. How do you feel about that? How does that align with your privacy principles and your business strategy? Maybe you're going to be engaging in a lot more email marketing or social media. So how are you creating login experiences, collecting more email marketing? There's going to be more laws. We'll have to see where they will play out. My personal belief is globally, you're going to have more that liken to GDPR. And in the United States, somewhere around kind of the second version of what we have in California. But politics is always a dart, so don't hold me to that particular piece. There's the idea of digital fingerprinting. There's also sort of this idea of demographic attributes and browsing histories. Here were a few studies that I found to kind of show the effectiveness of where this is going. I do believe that, again, we will have this future movement to some other types of identifiers, but it will not be the same of one-to-one exactly where we had really what was considered personal information. And with all of these, many people will ask me about blockchain technology and some others. Where will the future reside? Well, the basic principles of these laws have to still be maintained. You have to inform the user of what you're doing. You have to let me opt out. And you have to make sure that in some countries, like in the EU, you have a legal basis. Now, actually here in the United States, you're going to need to have what's called a business purpose. It's just not as strict. You get to kind of decide what your business purpose is, and you need to be able to defend it, compared to what you might have in Europe, where you have 6 lawful basis. Most digital activity falls under consent or legitimate interest. Legitimate interest is kind of the business purpose that most people in the United States would come up with. Recognizing that we want to connect with our customers and our prospects. We need advertising to get there. It's reasonable to have analytics to be able to understand how well did we do. And at the same time, we have to manage what is the expectation of the customer, and what type of data did I use to get it there, and what company did I use to get it there, and who is this new company with this fabulous new idea? Can I trust them? Your customers are looking to connect and trust you for your product and service. And you also, in turn, have to make sure that the entire ecosystem for the advertising is built on trust. So with that being said, I'm going to post the slides in the Slack channel. You can also grab the slides on my website, but of course I show you a website, and like all good fun technology, this page appears to be broken. So I'm hoping that later today it will not be broken anymore and will magically work. The tech gremlins are not working in my favor today. So I do apologize for that in advance, but again, I'll have it in the Slack channel. So I'm going to move to questions now and see what we have. So let's see, if one is nonprofit and cross-domain tracks, do we still need to consider privacy laws? For others, how can I best communicate the fact that even if we're in one state, when we get traffic from another state, privacy laws still apply? There's a belief out there that I'm in Texas, so I don't need to worry about anyone from California. We all know web traffic doesn't come from one state only. So that's a really great question. So the first is I'm going to assume that this question might be a CCPA only question. So the nonprofit piece is kind of an interesting one because in the nonprofit world, you're technically excluded from CCPA. But that doesn't mean that the individuals understand that. They're not reading the law and they don't know the difference of, oh, the nonprofits are excluded and the profit people are the only ones. So you have to kind of think about that consumer mindset. And I actually host a podcast with my husband. It's called the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. And we've just interviewed a chief privacy officer from a nonprofit who takes the position that, you know what, our individuals expect us to manage their privacy. And they also take the approach of, well, regardless of what state they're in, even if there's not a privacy law there, if they're asking me to opt out or asking me about their information, I need to address that. So to connect with the individuals in your organization who say, well, I'm in Texas, so I don't need to worry about anyone from California. If you meet the definition of requirements for California, I would, well, actually if you're a nonprofit, then it's kind of an interesting conundrum there. So it is true. You have people, it's a global economy and it's a national economy as well. From a nonprofit point of view, I would take the side of looking at it from a customer's point of view and kind of go from there. I hope that addresses it. There's a couple other questions I want to make sure I get to. And if I didn't, by all means, please come back. Managing and evolving consumer consent in exchange for business value would seem an ideal role for marketing. Do you believe consent should be managed as a compliance matter or as a business value matter? This is a fabulous question. I'm so glad you asked it. I would say it should be a business value matter that needs to be asked with a compliance approach, because you want to make sure that you're meeting the compliance requirements, such as I can track it and I can revoke it at any time. But the language that you use to be able to ask for it should show the business value. So thank you so much for asking that question. How does the consent banner impact optimization tools? If you haven't given consent, how can marketing teams do A/B testing of content if you have to opt in first? Does this mean we should have holding pages to manage this? Well, you have to determine if it's going to be a strictly necessary cookie. So if it's optimization and it's a cookie that is collecting data, and again, I'm going to assume this is asking from a GDPR point of view, because remember, in the United States, you can still do this. You just have to let me opt out. But if you have a cookie that is only used for this analytical purpose, you might be able to have it be a strictly necessary cookie, in which case it's not an opt-in. But if that optimization tools talk to any of the advertising and that data is getting sent over into the advertising world and they get to use it too, then it's a consent piece. So you'd have to be, A/B testing, I opted into this versus this one. I hope that answers that question too. Really fascinating question. For GDPR, why is it explicit consent needed for SEO? How would you implement it? So this kind of goes back to, you might have a pixel connected for SEO purposes, but you're also doing SEM. And so you can't necessarily segregate those two pieces if the cookies are talking to each other. So in those scenarios, you would need that consent. In many countries, it is opt-in consent regardless of the kind of pixel, unless they are strictly necessary. There are a couple countries that believe an analytics pixel is reasonable to be able to understand what's happening on the site. It seems that everyone is implementing multiple annoying pop-ups about data collection. Oh my goodness, yes. Shouldn't all this be managed in the browser instead of site by site? Well, that's kind of what the global privacy control is trying to do, is manage it at a browser level. So we'll have to see how well that is adopted. It will only work if really all the companies kind of rely on the browser piece. But the way it works now is the browser manages that, then the company has to listen to the browser. So if the browser does all the work, but the company still doesn't basically listen and take what that browser setting is doing, then it doesn't work. But I do think, especially as we move away from so many cookie identifiers, we'll need to see something because they're annoying. I totally agree with you. And so many of them are wrong. If you want to know why they're wrong, come find me. I'd be happy to talk to you. How will this apply to TV streaming media, Hulu, Disney, even though authenticated still applies? And actually, there are consent mechanisms to be able to work with streaming. So depending on your specific scenario, I highly recommend that you look into that. But the compliance still applies. Doesn't really matter where you are. Do the cookies policies apply to temp session cookies? So a temp session cookie, kind of depending on what's in that temp session cookie and what happens with that data, would really determine that answer. If it is if it's a strictly necessary and kind of a legitimate interest, you might be able to document it in that specific scenario and then be able to have it be kind of default opt-in under those certain countries. Kind of depends on the specific situations there though. Here's a real back to basics question. Does a US-based site or app need to comply with GDPR for European users? Yes. Does a Virginia-based site need to comply with California rules for California users? Yes. So the way this works is it doesn't matter where the company is. So kind of back to the nonprofit who's in Texas but has California people. None of these laws care where you, the company, reside. I could be in Tahiti and have customers from all of these locations. As long as I'm meeting the minimum threshold, I'm in scope to have to manage my requirements to the law. I think I got through all of the questions.
Yeah, Jodi, I think that is all the questions. If anyone has any last minute questions, now is the time to throw it into the Q&A, but I think we made it through all of them. So Jodi, my head spins when I hear people like you go through all of this, because it's like, I almost feel like if you were a good lawyer, almost every website could find a way. You could find a way to get every website in trouble, but it's amazing how much you have to juggle on top of your day job of just trying to actually be a good digital analyst and answer questions that people have. So I'm amazed that you can keep all of this straight in your head, and that all of us are going to have to learn all of this eventually. So
It
it's
is a
crazy.
lot. And I hope that we were able to break it down into a really 101 like level. So thank you so much for the opportunity to try and help uncomplicate a very complex topic.
Yeah, and I think it'd be cool if maybe in the future to have you come back and maybe go through some like real world case studies of like some stuff where either people got into trouble or they came up with like a really cool way to not have these things be like a negative to their clients, but actually kind of a positive. So maybe we'll do a 201 or 301 class in the future. So
That sounds good. Adam, actually, can I add one other thing that I didn't have in slides, but really important, I think, to this audience, is
yep.
the idea of dark patterns. So that just came out a couple weeks ago, the idea of trying to really trick someone into kind of staying if they opt out, like, are you sure you really want to opt out, and sort of trick the colors and the check boxes. That's a no-no under California from a law perspective. So kind of going to the idea of transparency and trust, making sure that your experience is favoring the individual, not really the company.
Yeah, and we did get one last question that popped in there that's kind of related to
Yes.
what you were just
So
saying.
for the time being, to be able to preserve as much data as possible, is it best to be transparent about data and hope for the best? So actually, you want to hold the least amount of data. That is a requirement under all of these laws. And the reason for that is for each data piece you hold, you're responsible. So your risk as an organization actually goes up for every single piece of data that you hold.
Okay,
So
cool.
only hold what you need for a business purpose.
Okay, well, I think we will sign off there. Jodi, thank you again so much. And I'll work on getting the recording into the Slack group. And Jodi, you have access to the Slack group if you want to upload your slides. I know some of them had a lot of words on them, so it might be good for people to study those. So thank you again. And thanks everyone for joining another SDEC session. But thanks, Jodi.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.